All right, so we'll get underway. I'd just like to introduce matters this evening. We'll then have introductions to the panelists. But as I see it this evening, it's meant to really lay bare the situation that we have before us on the ballot coming in November. And really just to say, really pretty shocking stuff. You see it right there. But, the ballot was released, what it will look like, just at the end of last week. So Initiative 434, Initiative 439, literally before us, I present to you life and death. And I don't mean to be too dramatic about that. That's what it will, in fact, be doing. And we have before us, then, the opportunity to affect what will be the final outcome. It's a decision that no doubt will affect generations, no matter what way it goes. And it was just a matter of a couple short years ago, we were celebrating the overturn of Roe v. Wade. We were thinking about, great kinds of moments forward of how do we move from illegal to unthinkable, to great inspirations in the ways of life and promotion of life. And now we find ourselves clinging to these vestiges. Several states have already chosen death, implementing this decision through all trimesters and until birth. So I think it's a quite stunning background for what we need to be doing right here, right now. So I just ask every one of you, we'll begin with that as background for what we're doing this evening as we begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God Almighty Father, creator of all human life, we implore your love and mercy upon the people of the state of Nebraska, as we face serious threats to the dignity and sanctity of human life. We beg of you, O Lord, to move the hearts and minds of all Nebraskans to vote against Initiative 439, which would do profound and lasting harm to women and babies in our state. Bestow upon us the grace, Eternal Father, to remain steadfast in our charity and care for all pregnant women and preborn babies, that they would know your protection and faithful love. Grant this prayer through your Son, Jesus Christ, and by the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Lady of Guadalupe, patroness of the unborn, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I think you know already our panel members, but I want to just introduce them by name, and then I'll pass the microphone to them that they might say a bit more about themselves. And we'll start with His Excellency Bishop James Conley, of course, our bishop here in Lincoln. Dr. Catherine Brooks, here also with us from Lincoln. And then Tom Benzer from the Nebraska Catholic Conference. Perhaps I'll pass the microphone first to His Excellency, and then to Dr. Brooks.
Okay, thank you, Monsignor Cucinato. Thank you for hosting us here at the Cathedral, the Mother Church of the Diocese of Lincoln, and welcome to all of you. I guess maybe by way of introduction, I've been involved in the pro-life movement really since shortly after I became a Catholic and a convert in college. I don't know if I was pro-life during college, but when I became a Catholic, I quickly realized, the truth about the unborn person. And then as I went through the seminary and was ordained a priest, one of my first assignments was to be the pro-life director for the Diocese of Wichita. And I served in that position for 7 years and really got involved in the pro-life movement seriously. We got involved in Operation Rescue. So yes, I'm a serial loiterer. I have a record. If you remember the Operation Rescue movement, civil disobedience. But with the permission of my bishop, and then I went on and got a degree in moral theology and studied more about the dignity of the human person. And then as a bishop, have tried to continue to preach and teach about the sanctity and dignity of every human life and to protect children and their mothers from abortion. So that's kind of my background in the pro-life movement.
My name is Katie Brooks, and I am a neonatologist here in Lincoln. I have practiced in a couple of other states as well and did my training in New Mexico, and also in Nebraska. I think I've been pro-life as long as I can remember. I don't ever remember not being. I used to go in high school, I'm from Lincoln, and pray at the abortion clinic, which used to be over on South Street, and have taken my kids to the current location. And I think as a physician, that just solidified my pro-life stance, and have continued to promote life in really everything that I do.
My name is Tom Benzer. I'm the Executive Director of the Nebraska Catholic Conference, and we do the public policy, government relations work on behalf of the 3 bishops here in Nebraska. So I've been at the conference for a mere 9 years, relative to my predecessor who's here tonight. He built the foundations of the conference very well, Jim Cunningham. But I've been at the conference for 9 years, and I was hired originally to do our pro-life and family policy work. As well as at the time, the Catholic Conference did pastoral pro-life activities across all 3 dioceses. So for all the parishes, we did not just public policy work, but also a lot of the other aspects of the pastoral care on the pro-life work. So really that's what I came to the conference to do, was to advocate for the unborn, for women, for families, and all of that. And so I've been doing that professionally now for 9 years, but prior to that, just been involved in the pro-life movement. In particular, when I got into law school, just had some really good pro-life friends who introduced me more in terms of like just being more of a prayer warrior for the unborn. Going to the abortion facility to pray there for the women in need and those things. And so really, yeah, just and then also with our first pregnancy, we had really tiny twin babies born at 28 weeks, and so really seeing the beauty of human life at such an early and tiny stage. Obviously just further solidified just the beauty of creation, the beauty and the innocence of tiny little babies. And so anyways, that's just kind of my background and kind of by way my pro-life activism.
Okay, excellent. So we conceived of this evening in this way, that we would engage. I have the luxury of being able to sort of interview my bishop and the good doctor, and then Tom Benzer as well. But so we'll try to hit on main points that may be on your mind as we try to prepare ourselves for the November ballot. But then we will open up to questions that are roughly 8 o'clock, and we'll try to wrap up in a 90-minute span at 8:30. So that's what we have. That's what the agenda is going to look like. So for His Excellency, before we jump into the substance of these Nebraska abortion-related ballot initiatives, can you give us some background on how we got to this point in Nebraska, in your perspective, obviously, and what national and state events brought us to the place where we are at, dealing even with the possibility, as I mentioned at the beginning, of late-term abortion initiatives for the 24 ballot?
Well, we all know that since 1973, the Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade mistakenly found a right to abortion in the federal Constitution. And we labored under that for over 50 years until June 24th, 2022, a little over 50 years, where the Supreme Court overturned its previous ruling and determined that there is no right to an abortion in the federal Constitution. And the good news is that since June 24th of 2022, there are hundreds, thousands of little children now who are alive because of that decision, who are just learning how to walk and talk, and whose mothers, because of that decision, have been spared the trauma of abortion. My best friend, who's the Archbishop of Oklahoma City, in Oklahoma, the last abortion was June 23rd, 2022. And so you know there's a lot of little Oklahomans that are running around, walking, crawling around, speaking, and mothers who maybe were abortion-minded or would have been abortion-minded, who would not be here today because of that decision. And that's one of the states that completely prohibited abortions after the Dobbs case. So, but that's not the case in most states. And I think God sort of gave us a little preview, which we weren't too aware of when it was leaked in April, that this decision could be overturned. And I know myself, I was just saying that this could never happen. I mean, I owe you a little faith. I knew we could, God could do it, but I didn't think it was going to happen, and it did. And in my home state of Kansas, which was the first state then to have a ballot initiative to protect children and mothers, failed. It was the first one of 7. So basically, since the Dobbs case, which then, the Dobbs case ruled that it was up to the states to determine any kind of regulation or prohibition on abortions, and that the federal Constitution said nothing about it, but it was up to each individual state to determine what kind of protections, if any, there would be to the unborn child. And so then it started to play out in the states, Kansas being the first one, and they lost. And then one after another, there were 7 states up to this point that attempted, there were pro-abortion amendments put into the Constitution which would protect abortion, various kinds of amendments, and each one of them succeeded. None of them were defeated. And so this year, we are one of, I think, 11 or 12 states that is continuing to try to protect abortion basically through all 9 months in our state. And that's where we are today. And so I think that we are at a moment, and why Nebraska? Well, I think that because of the success of these other 7 states, they really wanted to go after states, let's say we're very conservative states, red states, and so if they could get in Nebraska to fall, then that's a huge victory. So that's what we're faced with here in Nebraska, and I think that we can be, and I believe we can be the first state to push back and to be successful, which would also not only protect babies and women in our own state, but it would give hope to the rest of the country that it can be done. And the bad thing, I'll stop with this, and I'm not a lawyer, like Tom is, but we know that the law has a pedagogical effect. In other words, the law teaches. And so when the law changed in 1973, the bad law, which was passed, it taught 50 years of falsehood. And so even though the law changed, still the mentality now is people think that there should be a right to abortion in every state, that women should have a right to an abortion. That's what it taught for 50 years. And so it's going to be hard to change that mentality. So we have to change hearts, not only the law, but change hearts. And so we still have a lot of work to do to change hearts, because it's deformed 50 years of culture in our country.
Next, a question for Dr. Brooks. Were you personally surprised by the direction, firstly, maybe that legislators took, that initiatives have taken in other states, and then the voting patterns, as we've seen in other states, to push back, let's say, and to attempt to put into constitutions legal abortion through all 9 months?
I would say yes and no. I've grown up under, abortion being primarily legal. And so I think that has shaped our culture. I'm certainly not young, but I'm younger than 50. So I think what surprises me is that physicians are by and large pro-choice and support abortion. Although we take an oath to first do no harm, and somehow that doesn't seem to apply. The other thing that surprises me, and I think is important for people to understand, is that in both our Catholic bioethic teaching, as well as in medicine, there is room that if a mom is in serious harm, say there's an ectopic pregnancy, or mom is septic, and delivery is really the only option to save her life. not a direct abortion in terms of more of the active, but an induction of delivery or removal of the fallopian tube in the case of an ectopic pregnancy is actually allowed. And I was surprised in multiple forums that many physicians thought that if a state passed a law saying that abortion wasn't legal, that those moms would just be allowed to die. And that simply is just not true. So I think that when you're talking about those cases, which are very hard and very scary, it's important to understand that both from our Catholic teaching, but also from the actual medical laws or regulations, it's still allowed to treat those women.
Excellency, we'd like to turn to you then to present to us the language of these proposals and to sort of lay it out yourself as you see it with your initial general reactions to both initiatives.
Well, I think what we have to keep in mind is that our main goal is to defeat 439. I mean, it's the most radical, the most horrific, the most evil thing that we've ever faced, I think, in our state and in any state, really. So I think we really have to all hands on deck and to do all we can to defeat this. So 439 reads, and I think you might have it in front of you. And it's interesting, these ballot initiatives, they're not clear, and they're filled with all kinds of legalese language that the average person, even an educated person has to kind of scratch their head. What do they mean by this? What does this mean? And I think it's purposely done, to tell you the truth. Not assigning motives, but I think it's purposely done to make it vague. So the ballot initiative 439 reads, all persons shall have a fundamental right to abortion until fetal viability, or when needed to protect the life or health of the pregnant patient without interference from the state or its political subdivisions. Fetal viability means the point in pregnancy when, in the professional judgment of the patient's treating healthcare practitioner, there is a significant likelihood of the fetus's sustained survival outside the uterus without the application of extraordinary medical measures. Now that's pretty, that's not very clear. There's all kinds of confusing things said. For example, all persons. Why didn't they say all women? Well, because all persons would include teenagers, any young girls. And so there's the first thing. A fundamental right to abortion until fetal viability. Again, presuming that this is a fundamental right that everybody recognizes and accepts. And fetal viability, that is determined by the person who is treating the woman, so the abortionist. And so that you can make a judgment on when viability could be. Or there is a significant likelihood that the fetus sustains survival outside the uterus without application of extraordinary medical measures. Like, for instance, many babies are born with all kinds of needs. And so then the abortionist could say, well, this baby's going to need some care if it was delivered today. Let's say 30 weeks or 32 weeks or 28 weeks. Of course it would. And so therefore the determination would be that in the professional judgment of the treating healthcare practitioner that this baby qualifies to be killed, basically. So, it's filled with all kinds of obscurity and, confusion. So that's, I think, what we have to do is to reveal just basically how radical it is, because it really does say that it's determined by the abortionist that that abortion would be legal through all 9 months.
Thank you, Excellency. And I kind of jumped the gun, but yeah, maybe as long as we're on the subject, Initiative Measure 434, which we're urging a vote for, is worded, except when a woman seeks an abortion necessitated by a medical emergency or when the pregnancy results from sexual assault or incest, unborn children shall be protected from abortion in the second and third trimester, which is the present law in the state of Nebraska, to see that enshrined. And not obviously the Catholic teaching, but what we're urging would be voted for positively as a measure of diminishing numbers and of protecting life such as we're able at this moment. Okay, no further editorial comment from me, but I'm sorry, I jumped the gun a little bit on that. This is for Tom. As we read the language of 439, that initiative, the bishop noted it's full of loaded terms, to say the least. The Nebraska Catholic Conference has gone so far as to say that the language is deceptive and will be unsafe and will lead to unregulated abortion, that it is simply un-Nebraskan. Could we start by unpacking the meaning of those first two words, all persons and the pregnant patient, as well as the language of a fundamental right to abortion? What does this all mean?
Yeah. Thank you, Monsignor. And Bishop gave a great preview of a lot of some of the problems that are contained in this language. But right, as Bishop said, we look at the first two words, and already you can see, problems with the language. And again, the authors who wrote this certainly knew what they were writing. They didn't write these they didn't write these terms by accident. They were intentionally written words with specific legal meaning and specific legal connotations and specific legal implications. So as Bishop noted, all persons, right? In the law, persons doesn't just include an adult individual, it includes a minor as well. And so you'll see that language means that you're creating a fundamental right to abortion for a minor child. Well, what's the significance of that? The significance of that, for example, in Nebraska, is that we have laws currently on the books that require parental notification and parental consent if a minor child is going to seek an abortion. So at the very least, parental involvement needs to take place. But if you've created a fundamental right to abortion for that minor child, you're basically, this language would undo any parental involvement that is currently contained in the law, because it's a fundamental right to the child, and the parent has no involvement in that child's fundamental right. And so you've got language like that that's problematic. Also, when we look at this language of fundamental right, those are major terms, right? When for us, as Americans, when we think of fundamental rights, we're probably thinking of things like the freedom to worship, the free exercise of religion. We're thinking of the freedom of the press, or what we're doing tonight, freedom of association, in addition to free exercise of our religion. We think of things like the right to bear arms. Like, we think of these really big, monumental, fundamental, and foundational rights when we think about that. Well, that's what they're trying to elevate abortion to here, is a fundamental right. And so even just that language alone, a fundamental right, is important in terms of what they're trying to achieve and attain. And then when you think about that as well, I tell people, well, what's the implications of a fundamental right? Well, when you think about something like, a child having a fundamental right to education, for example, then you think about, well, if that child has a fundamental right to an education, isn't there some sort of corresponding fundamental duty on the people? And in Nebraska, we've recognized that as being something that we're going to fund a child's education, in the public schools. We're working to make sure that money follows the child wherever they go. But that's the thing here. So when you're talking about a fundamental right, you're going to start raising implications of, are there implications in duties upon the taxpayer to have to fund abortions? So what about laws that currently prohibit taxpayer funding of abortion in Nebraska? Would those be overrun by the fact that somebody has a fundamental right to an abortion and lead to taxpayer funding of abortion. I think that's very plausible and very much could be a likelihood of what comes out of this language, as we've seen in other states where they've established something like a fundamental right to abortion. So again, already just within 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words, you've got a lot of loaded terminology already.
Thank you, and that leads to the most loaded of all, I'm going to boldly say, regarding viability. More than half of the language of 439 is dedicated to explaining what viability is. Perhaps Dr. Brooks could explain what that would signify in terms of this word to be our law.
So I think that most people think that viability means something around 24 weeks because that has previously been established as a lot of states where they would limit abortion, but also sort of from the medical world where people thought that those babies would do okay and have okay outcomes. But what's really interesting is there's really no definition of viability. And I would say even since I finished fellowship in 2015, the discussion has changed quite a bit. And so probably 10 or 15 years ago, people thought that 22 weeks, like routinely caring for those babies was maybe not in the best interest of those babies because they were unlikely to survive or unlikely to survive without significant medical issues. However, some university settings are actually routinely resuscitating those babies, and they're having as good of outcomes as like the 24 and 25 weekers. So as we get better and better at treating these patients, it does kind of change, and there's really no established definition or even what it means. Like how long they can survive. Does it mean that they can survive without having significant impairments? Does it mean that they have a normal outcome? And different people ascribe different meanings to that term viability, which makes it really challenging. I want to make sure that I touched on all the things I was supposed to touch on. There are places, and unfortunately where I did my fellowship, that much later in pregnancy was considered viable. And so the culture was that up until 26 weeks, parents were actually given the option whether or not to resuscitate, which seems really, it's very different than the Midwest values, and those babies are routinely considered to have good outcomes. So I think that it's very loaded, and I think that even in medicine we don't have a good answer for it, and so for the public to understand what that means is probably asking a bit too much.
Thank you. We'll turn back to His Excellency. We'd like to, in a particular way, ask him to reflect a bit on pastoral involvement with late-term abortion. He had some real experience with that in Wichita, as it was one location where late-term abortion was carried out, as we also did in Nebraska. But your reflection on what this could mean, really reversing course to permit such legalization of abortion in all trimesters.
First of all, thank you. First of all, one of the things that I was asked to do by my bishop in Wichita was to start a post-abortion healing and reconciliation program called Project Rachel, which has been around since the late 80s and early 90s, as reaching out to women who've had abortions. And oftentimes we in the pro-life movement are accused of saying, oh, all we're interested in saving babies, What about the women? And so I had really not thought too much about that until I got involved with post-abortion healing and reconciliation, not only for mothers who've gone through the trauma of abortion 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, but also fathers who've gone through that, and parents and grandparents of women. And it just opened up a whole new appreciation for the effect that abortion has, not only the death of a child, but also the trauma that a woman goes through. And sometimes it takes 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years that she carries this wound with her and finally realizes, she knows deep down inside that what she did, was not good. Now she may, and one of the things I really learned to appreciate is that I totally understand why a woman might choose abortion, because every person she turns to tells her, especially if she's a teenager, her parents might influence her, her doctor might say, yes, this is the best thing, certainly the father of the child says, yes, you've got to get this abortion. So everybody she looks to trust to help her to make good choices says, no, this is the right good thing. But deep down inside she knows that it's not. And sometimes she carries that with her for a long time. Sometimes, hopefully, she comes to realize it soon and gets help and healing and knows that there's hope and life after that, and she can be forgiven. But so the wounds of this terrible evil it has on everyone involved with it, it's just a tragedy in every way you look at it. So as pastor, we need to love them both, right? And as pastors, we do love them both. Someone who finds himself in a situation where they're pregnant and they're in a crisis, we need to love them both and reach out to them. One little anecdote, which is kind of horrific, but I like to tell this story to tell you how corrupt the situation was, at least in Wichita. We had a late-term abortionist who was really known all over the country. George Tiller, God rest his soul, he was killed, he was murdered, which, is a tragedy in itself. But again, this is another tragedy. He wouldn't have been murdered, if he wasn't doing these abortions. But it's a tragedy all the way around. Anyway, short story, it just tells you just how corrupt it can be. I knew him, he knew me, and because he knew that I was a pro-life director. And he had a patient come in, a young woman and her husband. And she was in her 3rd trimester, and she sought this late-term abortion, but they were Catholic. And they requested that a priest come in with her, and they asked him if he would find a priest. And so I got a phone call, and he asked me if I would come in while the procedure took place. And I said, for what? Well, they want baptism. And I said, well, George, I can't baptize a dead baby. I know that, Father. I know that, but I'm just meeting the needs of my patient. And they requested this, and I'm just following through on their request. And I said, well, I couldn't do that, George. I couldn't do that. I can't believe you're even asking me this. And I know way you feel about the procedure. Call it what it is. But then the Holy Spirit struck me and said, wait a second. I said, for every baptism, we have to meet with the couple to prepare them for baptism. So let's rethink this, and I'll meet with this couple, and we'll see what we can do. Because I figured I could just talk to the couple. And he said, well, okay, let me talk to them, and I'll call you back. I never heard back. But that just shows you how corrupting the whole thing is. It's just, who would... Well, anyway, I'll leave it at that.
I want to get the language correct. We haven't talked about this language about patients treating healthcare practitioner. I think every one of our eyes probably, raises on that one. What is that really meant to encompass, broaden out in this language of 439?
Yeah, so again, in this language is a lot of loaded terms with a lot of meaning. And this is another one. What does it mean that fetal viability is a point in pregnancy when, in the professional judgment of the patient's treating healthcare practitioner, again, there's a significant likelihood of the fetus's sustained survival outside the uterus, that the application of extraordinary medical measures. As Bishop alluded to earlier, when we're talking about the treating healthcare practitioner, who are we talking about? We're talking about an abortionist. And we're talking about an abortionist who has probably little to zero relationship with the woman who's coming in to see her. And frankly, as we know from Planned Parenthood, has a pretty highly vested financial interest in the outcome of that pregnancy being the termination through abortion. And so that is who viability the determination of viability is being placed into the hands of. That doesn't make any sense. Then in addition to that, the language uses, it is patients treating healthcare practitioner. Well, here's the deal. In Nebraska, since 2010, and maybe this is earlier, but in Nebraska, we have required that the abortion be done by at least a doctor, right? It can't be a nurse practitioner, it can't be some other form of healthcare, practitioner, it's a doctor. And in Nebraska, you have to be physically present, and that was in order to upfront, basically combat, essentially webcam abortions, so that Leroy Carhart wasn't dispensing abortion pills to some, girl out in Scottsbluff or something of that nature. So it's required not only to be a physician, but in the physical presence of a physician. So this language of the fact that a treating healthcare practitioner can be making the professional judgments, and here raises real questions of who is going to be allowed to be able to do the abortions, okay? And actually just last Monday, 1 week ago from today, the Nebraska Supreme Court had oral arguments between the pro-life and the pro-abortion side to determine whether this should go to the ballot or not, based on what's called the single subject rule. But during those oral arguments, the lawyer for the pro-abortion side was asked, wouldn't this kind of language allow for, like, let's say, an unlicensed midwife to be able to make these determinations? And they have to basically acknowledge that, yeah, that would be a possibility under this language. So again, the fact that this isn't just the professional judgment of a trained physician who's gone through a lot of schooling, et cetera, it really opens the door up to a lot of different people being able to be involved in the abortion procedure, including abortion facility workers. Okay, so that should be concerning. And again, to go back to something that Dr. Brooks was talking about earlier, they're making that judgment based on the significant likelihood of the fetus's sustained survival outside the uterus without the application of extraordinary medical measures, right? All of those qualifying terms that are going to be left very much up to the subjective determination and the subjective judgment of the person involved. Okay, and I often, when we talk about this language, I share the story of, like I mentioned at the beginning, we had twins at the beginning of our pregnancy. At the beginning of our marriage, we had twins, and one of them had what was called an intrauterine growth restriction. She was growing a little bit slower at a lesser pace than her twin sister. And so we ended up having to deliver at 28 weeks because Therese's nutrition flow basically was ceasing, and she was better outside of the womb than she was inside of the womb. But again, at 28 weeks, it was an incredible experience and something that Dr. Brooks lives through every day, but I only had to live through once. But I mean, when they delivered by C-section, and they took those little babies, Therese was just under 2 pounds, and Monica was just over 2 pounds. And they took them out of the womb and they ran them to another room, and each one of them, I swear, had half a dozen medical professionals around them, whether they were doctors, respiratory therapists, nurses, NICU nurses. Then they got them stabilized, they put them in their little NICU box, and then they hauled them off to the NICU, and then they got to the NICU, and then they set them up with all sorts of machinery, and then they were getting 24/7 nursing attention, which my wife was a nurse, and it registered in my mind that, hey, how was your evening at work, honey? It was awful. I had 10 patients, 12 patients. It was a horrible night in the hospital. Well, here I am with my 2 little 2-pounders, and each one of them has their own nurse 24/7. Right? All of those things. Do you think those girls had a significant likelihood of sustained survival outside the uterus without the application of extraordinary medical measures? No. And unfortunately, we lost little Therese 2 weeks later, and baptized, and she's in heaven, and she's our little saint. But Monica's 8.5 years old. And they're wonderful, wonderful human beings, as tiny as they were, for the little amount of time we got with Therese, and for all the time we've gotten with Monica. 2 amazing human beings that would not have met this definition. And we could have been easily suggested, at least in Nebraska, right? At least at 12 weeks, the doctor's not going to be going, oh, hey, by the way, we're at 14 weeks, 16 weeks, 18 weeks. Are you sure you don't want to think about abortion? It's still an option, right? Because that's what they'll be doing with this language. 22 weeks, 24 weeks, the pregnancy's again, you still, if you want, an option on the table is abortion. Imagine saying that, having to deal with that every doctor's visit, that somebody's going to be constantly putting that in front of you, 22 weeks, 24 weeks, 26 weeks, 28 weeks. Oh, we don't know how this is going to go. We don't know if your babies are going to survive. Maybe it'd be easier to do the abortion. Again, that's a kind of culture, right? This kind of language is going to be built into the medical practice. That kind of a culture of abortion and almost even the expectation of abortion. So I share that because of who will make those types of determinations and on what little basis.
I sit at the chair, so. Back to Dr. Brooks. On this determination of viability, how does that concern you as a life-affirming medical professional? Do you think, or do you see times when the future of unborn babies could be misdiagnosed, wrongly diagnosed, or even sometimes where the biases and recommendations for abortion might prevail?
I think I could talk a long time about this, so I'll try to be succinct. I think who determines the viability is a very, very big problem. One thing is that there's not really that many people in the medical world who have consistent exposure to babies who are born very early or very sick. So people who don't see that on an everyday basis have a very different interpretation of what is happening. And I would say, by and large, feel that babies are much sicker than I might feel that they are, because I've seen thousands of babies and I know what to expect at different ages or with different pathologies that are going on. One thing that I see very routinely is that a lot of the OBs, after they deliver a mom and the baby has to come to the NICU for whatever reason, they'll come and they'll ask me, how is the baby doing? And maybe they're there to check on mom, but sometimes to check on the baby too, just because they're kind and they want to know how things are going. They'll go and talk to the mom and then they'll take a peek at the baby, and they'll often come to me and say, oh my gosh, this baby is so sick. They're just like, they're not doing well. I just can't even believe it. And I try to maintain composure and say, well, actually, I think they're doing really quite well. And kind of just what I would expect them to do. But it highlights, and I would say the majority of the OBs that I interact with are actually pro-life, and so it's not really a matter of abortion or whether or not these babies are valued. But it's more that the exposure is different, and so their interpretation of the baby being sick is not my interpretation. Because I have a different exposure and a different level of comfort with kind of what is happening with them. I do think that there's a huge bias or potential bias that if a mom is diagnosed as having a problem with the pregnancy or that the baby has an issue, a lot of times things resolve in time, and so it'll be followed, but I do think that there is a lot of potential for more encouragement of abortion. I have definitely seen times where there was a pretty certain diagnosis of something that would be potentially life-altering or at least needing some intervention, and the baby is born, and we do postnatal or testing after the baby is born, and actually the baby is fine. I've seen lots of babies do much better than anyone would anticipate, even better than I would anticipate. And I think also the medical world in general is more pessimistic about outcomes than people are. So it's been shown over and over again that if you have a list of diagnoses that may change how you interact with your family or with going to school or just with your environment, that the medical world sees that as much more of a problem than either the individual or the family. So in general, when physicians are giving recommendations or kind of discussing prognosis, most of the time it's going to have a more negative bias than what the families are going to see. So I don't think that people probably know that. We certainly know that, and I try at least to account for that, but the families don't know that. And I'm not sure maybe even every physician is aware and would consider that in their consultation or recommendations.
And just to follow up, I think the culture of death really thrives around despair and real difficult cases. You hear frequently in the discussion, what about these little children, like we'll name Saint Therese, where there's a very difficult decision. The circumstances are really very long odds, maybe say it that way, or maybe even you're convinced that it will not survive. And we know what our Catholic disposition is about. But what might you say to the broader world, those who, maybe even your patients or those encountering that, to give a perspective in a different vein, the culture of life, let's say?
So certainly because of what I do encounter lots of babies that have bad outcomes or even do pass away. I have yet to encounter a family that isn't forever thankful for those moments. Those families, and I have a particular interest in palliative care, and I enjoy working with those families. But those families have taught me so much about the value of those babies. And even when we know that they're not going to make it for very long, those moments are forever with them. And I think to take that away from a family is just cruel. A lot of times we don't know that a baby's going to die, but then because of complications of prematurity, that may be the ultimate outcome. But still, that family had time, and they had moments. They had the time to get to know their child, and not everyone gets that. And I think that those who do feel blessed and feel thankful. And I certainly have been taught more by those babies and their families than I could ever share with them. Each baby, I think you see it the most with twins just because you expect them to be the same, but every baby is so unique and so different in their personalities. And it's really amazing. And I have this privilege of seeing babies at a time when most people never ever get to, when they're so tiny and they're so fragile, yet they're so strong and mighty. And it's such a special time to be with families.
Back to Tom. Once again on that pro-abortion initiative language 439, it would create a fundamental right to abortion. But it also talks about this non-interference from the state. I think we know a bit about that, but what exactly does that mean? Would this have a further impact on other state laws that we currently have in place protecting women and babies from abortion?
Yeah, so earlier Monsignor was talking about the viability language being some of the language that he was most concerned about in this proposal. And I think that's absolutely true. I talk to people and I'm like, I think this is like the worst language in this proposal, this without interference from the state. Because here's what it does, here's what I am afraid it's going to do at the end of the day. That as Bishop said, for 50 plus years, here in Nebraska, we have been working day in and day out to have life-affirming laws. From the moment Roe came down, what did we do in the movement? We fought immediately. And we did everything in our power for days and weeks and months and years and decades to chip away at Roe versus Wade. To have all sorts of laws that ultimately chipped away at what that so-called right was intended to create, until eventually the infrastructure just collapsed. And so through that, we have 50 years of laws that we've built up. Those laws might be things like basic informed consent for a woman seeking abortion, so that there's some basic fundamental information that is given to her prior to her making that kind of a decision. We have things like waiting periods, right? So in order that there can be some sort of cool down period, right? Perhaps it's an emotional moment, she doesn't think she can carry the pregnancy through, but maybe 24, 48 hours later she goes, I can do this. Maybe somebody stepped into her life and says, we're with you. Maybe she was fleeing domestic violence and was able to get away from a relationship that was coercive, and therefore not have to have gone through the abortion. We have, on the informed consent law route too, we have just a couple of years ago, we passed an abortion pill reversal information act. Because now in Nebraska, most abortions are not surgical. Actually, they're chemical. They're a 2-drug process. And so we have a law that we passed that requires that when those drugs are given to the woman, that she's given information that if she changes her mind between the first pill and the second pill, there's a hotline number she can call that will connect her with physicians who will help attempt to reverse that abortion process through basically high-dose progesterone. All right, and that's been shown to be successful for bringing that pregnancy back to a state of viability, and they can continue to carry. But even when they can't carry, they're happy that they got the opportunity to make a second choice. We have laws like that. We have laws that ban, we did a ban on partial birth abortion that then also succeeded at the federal level. We have, and a few years ago, we passed the dismemberment abortion ban to basically say there are just, all abortion is barbaric, but there are some particularly egregious forms of abortion that no civil society should have in effect. And we've had laws to protect against those types of practices. So we have all these laws for 50 plus years that we've been passing. All right, we have conscience rights protections, we have taxpayer funding protections. And so let me ask you this question for a moment, just think in your head. Do you think those laws are an interference with the right to an abortion? The answer is yes. And how do we know that? Well, we look at the U.S. Supreme Court in the early 90s when they decided the Casey decision, which essentially reaffirmed what Roe v. Wade had to say on abortion. And in Casey, the U.S. Supreme Court said, we have always said that the right to abortion that we created in Roe was always with regulation by the state. The state always had some interest in regulating the life of the unborn child or the health and welfare of the mother. Always we've said it's with some regulation. We never said it was without interference from the state. Because if it was without interference from the state, then the state would not be able to regulate the procedure whatsoever. So again, when we talk about what this language means, the authors of this language put that in there knowing that they could point back to Casey versus Planned Parenthood and say, see, back in the early 90s, the US Supreme Court said the terms without interference from abortion means that you cannot regulate the process. And so that's going to lead to 50 years of pro-life laws being in jeopardy. 50 years of a lot of efforts of people in this room, a lot of tears, a lot of prayer, etc. And so to me, that language is particularly problematic because you have a fundamental right without interference from the state, which means that your state legislature is going to have their hands tied behind their backs when it comes to trying to adopt pro-life type laws, or at least have some level of regulation on this so-called fundamental right to abortion. And that's very concerning language that, again, people in the middle who are mixed and confused on this, when you tell them something like that, they can say, wait a minute, even though I'm kind of conflicted on this, that's way too far for me, right? So that shows you kind of the extreme nature of what's being proposed here.
Thank you. Excellency, especially just by way of introduction to the group, as you're so very involved in Catholic healthcare throughout the U.S., and as an Episcopal advisor to the Catholic Medical Association nationally, when you speak to other medical professionals already facing these proposals like this Initiative 439, what are you learning? Is there anything that you might wish to add from their experience, other things you're hearing from across the nation?
One thing comes to mind. I just got back from the annual conference of the annual education conference for the Catholic Medical Association. We had 75 medical students and residents, including, in addition to 750 Catholic physicians at this conference. And I had a chance to visit with the 75 medical students and residents, and they were so impressive. These young people who were thoroughly Catholic, and they were very bright, and they were very filled with zeal for their faith and for their profession. Future physicians, future doctors in the communities. And one of the things that the residents were talking about, which concerned them, is that as they were looking for residency programs in different states and different hospitals, they were having to look at the laws of the states to see what kind of conscience protection rights were there. Now, when you were looking at your residency program, I don't know if you reviewed state laws to see where you could, match yourself for a residency program. But this is what the young people now are concerned about: is they want to practice medicine, but they also want to be protected so they won't have to do something against their conscience. Now, these young people would never do anything against their conscience, and so basically they would lose their job or lose their residency. So those are the real issues that they're faced with today. And so it's so important that these laws do protect their conscience rights. And I know that physicians who practice in communities where these laws have been passed are now getting pressure, in hospitals especially, under rules and regulations that the Health and Human Services now are trying to pass in hospitals, forcing Catholic hospitals to do abortions. Now, that'll never happen. We'll shut down before that happens. But that's the kind of pressure that is mounting in the medical field. So it's becoming more and more difficult, I think, for pro-life physicians to practice. And that's why I told these medical students, I said, you are the future heroes, because you are going to be the lights that are going to shine, in the future to lead others to really the authentic healing and following in the footsteps of the divine physician to really heal and bring healing to those who are suffering.
I'd just like to go back to Tom even just for a moment about the promotional materials that the Catholic Conference has produced regarding the 439 being Un-Nebraskan. What is that reference in particular?
Yeah, so what do we mean that this is Un-Nebraskan, right? So there's going to be a lot of money spent on this proposal. Okay, when you look at states like Ohio and Michigan where they had similar ballot initiative efforts, you're talking like the pro-abortion side was spending $40, $50, $60 million. And that wasn't local money. Okay, that's out-of-state special interest groups, philanthropists, etc., saying, here's what we want to do. Since we can't get what we want done in the legislature, we're going to see if we can spend boatloads of money and see if we can essentially trick the electorate into adopting our abortion ideology. And so that's what you have here. You have special interest groups from out of state coming in and saying, we're going to fund this project to basically turn Nebraska on its head. Okay, so that it's a pro-abortion state rather than a pro-life state. And so that's really problematic. That's what you have coming in. But then also, right, we're a state that is building a culture of life and says, we're here to walk with you. If you have a tough pregnancy, we are here with you. We will walk together. We will do whatever it takes. All right? But that's not what a culture of abortion is that's informed by a legal infrastructure of abortion. Okay, and so that's really, ultimately, that's demeaning to women, right? That to have a legal infrastructure that essentially says, abortion's here for you at all 9 months of this pregnancy. And so that's really concerning as well. And where you have a legal infrastructure of abortion and you have a culture of abortion, I think, like I've said earlier, you can have an expectation of abortion, that it's something that people will do or should do. It's not just something that's there for somebody's choosing, but there's all sorts of coercive mechanisms to sort of choose that. And I think you saw this most clearly right after the Dobbs decision came out. Right after the Dobbs decision came out, corporate America steps up and says the following: hey, if you live in a state that has those pro-life laws, here's what we'll do. We'll give you $500, we'll give you 2 weeks of vacation, and we'll buy you a plane ticket. So you can get to another state where you can go get an abortion, and then when you're done with that, you return. You can return to work. Your job is safe. We still got a spot for you. Okay, that's a culture of abortion that incentivizes, that pays for, that almost expects it. Because what's the reverse of that? The reverse of that is a corporate culture that says, you're pregnant. We are so excited. This is amazing. I don't know if this is your first, well, you should know, they're their employer. If this is your first or this is your 10th. We are so excited for you. This is a great opportunity. We are so happy that you're bringing another human into this world. You're a mom, your job's here. We've got some paid leave when you need to take off of that baby, and when you return, your job's still going to be waiting for you, and we're here in open arms. And we know you're going to be late for the rest of your life because of your children. You know? So, right, that's a culture of life. That's a culture of life. It's informed by laws that are life-giving and life-affirming. Okay, as Monsignor said at the beginning, this is sort of a choose to stay who you will serve. Will you choose life or will you choose death? Okay? And the way of Nebraska is to be life-affirming and to create a culture of life and to have laws that affirm life and protect moms and care for moms. And that's what we're doing every day. So this proposal really is coming from out-of-state interest groups who are funding a lot of local advocacy and activist groups to basically try to put this law onto the books in our state. But we can stop that.
Maybe just building upon that culture of life language, go back to Dr. Brooks again. In terms of being a culture of life affirming physician, could you share a bit of your vision, a bit of your view and how you can assist women in difficult pregnancies, maybe even crisis pregnancies where they really are vexed by the decision that's in front of them?
I think, like what Tom said, is we walk with them and we guide them. We give them information. We give them the support to continue to take care of themselves and therefore their baby. I think acknowledging that some pregnancies have outcomes that aren't expected and that aren't wanted is necessary. To acknowledge that it's a stressful time. Even if it's a wanted pregnancy, it can be stressful and it's life-changing. But when there's things that happen, maybe there's something that is wrong with the baby and someone tells them to have an abortion, to acknowledge that it is really hard and it is not what they wanted, to be empathetic, to really share that we know that this isn't what you wanted, this isn't the outcome you were hoping for, but then to speak to the value of that baby and the value of getting to know him or her, even if it is only for a short time. And maybe even if the baby doesn't survive even delivery, but the mom still carried that baby and cared for him or her. And I think just changing it to be an overall positive experience that will bring value both to her life, her family's life, but also to the baby is really important, but in a way that validates and empathizes with the challenges that she is facing.
So I kind of had a spoiler earlier on, but let's go back to Tom to reference Ballot Initiative 434 and its language and our response and how it was conceived.
Yeah, so not only do you have Initiative 439, right, that we want to urge people, particularly Catholics, to vote against, But also there's Initiative 434. And Initiative 434 really came about as a response by medical professionals to say, hey, wait a minute, there's this pro-abortion proposal, why can't we get something out there so that there's another option for people to choose at the ballot box? Because that's one of the problems that occurred in other states, is they went to the ballot and they thought they only had one decision. They thought they only could, basically they had to pick on this abortion proposal, and oftentimes they were being told, hey, it's either voting for this abortion proposal, which allows for some abortions, even though it's all abortions, versus your state doesn't allow any abortions at all. And they were forced with this binary at the ballot box. Okay, and so what this is really an opportunity to get outside that binary choice at the ballot box to say, here's a different proposal that it basically ensures, as Monsignor said earlier, it basically enshrines what we currently have in our laws, which is protection at 12 weeks, with exceptions in what are called the hard cases. And so this is basically ensuring that that at least is protected. So it provides protection for the unborn child in the state constitution in the second and third trimester. And why is that important? Well, because currently the state constitution doesn't say anything on the topic of abortion. It essentially just leaves the whole thing in the hands of the legislature. So this creates at least a level of protection in the second and third trimester, and then leaves the first trimester, and then sort of the hard cases. It leaves those up to the legislature to determine how it's going to provide protection for human life in those areas. So it provides us the opportunity as pro-lifers to say, hey, we've got some base level protection in the Constitution, and we still reserve the power to work with our legislature to ensure that we can provide further protections for women and children. And so that's what's going on in that proposal. There have been some that have stated, well, hey, doesn't this create a right to abortion in the first trimester? The answer to that is it does not. It puts that first trimester in those hard cases into the hands of the legislature and allows us to still go about sort of the process of representative government through our legislators to try to provide protection in the future. So perhaps we could provide protection in the future at 10 weeks or at 8 weeks or at 6 weeks, or where there's a detectable heartbeat, right? Those things that we're always striving to do as Catholics, to create a culture of life from the moment of conception, of course, until natural death. And so that's what that language does in it's not a legislative bill, but Initiative 434. Initiative 434, right, is a constitutional amendment that's offering that alternative. And again, there was a lot of legal analysis and moral analysis of this early on, and it is morally permissible for Catholics to support this language. And in fact, in this go around, the position of the three bishops is to urge Catholics to support LB 434. It's an important countermeasure and definitely an important defensive mechanism against what's going on in Initiative 439. And this sometimes comes up in Q&A, but I'll preempt it right now. We get the question of, well, what happens if both pass, okay? Because here's a scenario, like Marion Miner in my office, he says, this isn't a multiple choice thing where you have to pick one or the other. You're going to be faced with each one of these initiatives separately. And what it takes to pass as a ballot initiative is that you simply have to get over majority support of those voting on the measure. Okay, so if both get majority support, 50%, then the one that will win out is the one that has more affirmative for votes. Okay, so it's for or against. So the one that has more for votes will win out, because if they conflict, one of them has to go to the wayside. These two measures cannot coexist. So the one that has more for votes, if they both have a majority, is the one that will win out. And so that's why it's also important, and we're urging people to vote for 434, because if the other one, if 439 gets majority support, we need 434 to get majority support, and we need it to have more affirmative for votes than the other one has. And so I also tell people, I hope that the other side doesn't get over 50%, but in Ohio they had 57%. In Michigan they had 57%. So you almost have to go into this assuming that they're going to be able to get 50%. We're going to do our best to keep them under 50%, but we have to do that, and so that's why we're, again, urging that Initiative 434 for people to vote for 434.
I think we'll wrap up questions there. I just ask, as we prepare to open the floor, first go back to His Excellency one last time in particular to ask the question as we go home, what can we do, what should we do, what must we do in preparation for November, and to hopefully see a happy outcome here.
Well, I think it's obvious to everyone in this room that we're dealing with diabolical powers here. So it's a spiritual battle. So pray, pray, pray. That's the first thing we do. I think it was St. Ignatius of Loyola or other saints said, pray as if it all depends on God, and work as if it all depends on us. I mean, both of those we've got to do. We can't just pray and not do anything, or we can't just work without praying. But prayer first, because we're dealing with an evil that's overcome and shadowed and distorted the reality of what we're talking about. And we know that. Everybody in this room knows that God, every conceived embryo is created in the image and likeness of God. It should be protected, it should be defended, and every woman deserves the protection and accompaniment of a loving community and a loving state. So that's what we're at against. So that's the first thing and foremost. But also to talk to your friends and family members, or anyone who might listen or might be confused about it, to tell them what we've learned tonight, and to tell them to tell others what they've learned tonight. We had a Zoom call meeting with all the priests in the Diocese of Lincoln on Saturday, or a week ago Saturday. Did the same thing in Grand Island and the same thing in Omaha. And we've got a series of homily helps that we're going to be giving to all the priests. I mean, tomorrow it's 8 weeks until Election Day, right?
Last word, 50 days.
50 days. And so early ballots come out October 7th, write-in ballots. So basically, I think because a lot of people vote mail-in, so they're going to be making their decisions in less than a month. So we have this window of time right now, tonight. Think about this when you go to bed at night. Tonight until October 7th to really make an impact of those that might, be on the fence. And you're going to hear about it from the pulpits. You're going to get prayer. You're going to get these prayer cards after every Mass. We're going to pray this prayer. We're going to have things in the bulletin and the Southern Nebraska Register. We've got the Southern Nebraska Register right here with us. So we're going to do everything to get the message out. So that's what we're going to try to do, and we need you to. And one of the things I'd like to challenge you to do is each week, as we lead up to this, the next 8 or 9 weeks, each week, talk to 5 to 10 new people. Okay? Each week, 5 to 10 new people between now and Election Day, and explain, what you think about this, and just invite them to consider this. Give them a sheet to take home, like these sheets. Maybe they're not going to talk to you again. I don't know, but they won't. They won't if you do it with joy and say, "Hey, look, I feel very strongly about this, and I'm concerned about this. Please consider this." And if we do that, we can. I don't know how many people are in here, but just multiply that by 100, and that's going to be 1,000 people. I'm not very good at math. I know that. But anyway, it'll multiply, right? It'll multiply. And this is where we got to be bold. We got to be bold. We've got a window of time. And so I know it's stepping out of your comfort zone, and nobody likes to talk about abortion. Talk about a downer, bringing up the A word. But we have to. We have to. You wouldn't be here tonight unless you're willing to do it.
Thank you. I think I'm going to move to question and answer. I'll wrap up when we're done with that. I'll leave one microphone up here with you guys. We have a little handicap in that I can only use one at a time. So I'll leave this with the good doctor, but you have to turn yours off until I turn mine on. Okay. Are there any questions out there from the floor?
I have a lot, but I will keep it short. First one is, you talked about special interest money. Do we have pro-life special interest money coming into our state? I hope. That's one question.
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. So the main kind of secular-facing public campaign is going to be protect women and children. So when you're thinking of like the TV ads or the radio ads or the mailers that'll probably come into your inboxes. It's probably going to be from Protect Women and Children. They're going to be the entity that's set up to do that kind of work. That said, the church, we are going to make a substantial investment in this effort as well. Bishop shared some of those efforts already with you, but there'll be things like postcard campaigns, making sure that registered Catholics are getting several postcards. Things like video text messages, right? You probably open your phone up sometimes and say, hey, it's Senator so-and-so, and I'd like you to vote for me, and there's a little video in there, and would you watch my video? We'll be sending out those kind of things as well. So there'll be all those kind of, phone banking, et cetera, making those calls to fellow Catholics. So there'll be that kind of investment from us. You've got other amazing organizations. Sandy Danick's here from Nebraska Right to Life. We've also got Nebraska Family Alliance, right? We've got these other groups who are going to try to bring home our base, to make sure that our people are turning out to vote and voting properly. But again, at the public level, you have Protect Women and Children.
Okay, materials, are there like signages and stuff like that that we could be putting out, like our properties, our homes, to start getting people familiar with the number? Because it's a little confusing. And then also, like, I got something in my inbox from another pro-life organization telling us to vote no on both. So a lot of people might be confused by that effort directed towards Catholics and Christians. So if you could address that.
So here's what I'll say. I'm going to go backwards there. The idea that one should vote against Initiative 434, that's a real problem. Okay, if you hear other pro-lifers saying that, I would say that's going to be a real problem, because when they vote against it, they're hurting the percent chance of 434 being successful, and when they hurt that, they're hurting its chances against 439. So that's what I would articulate. There are some, right, who have said, boy, I've thought about this a lot, I've prayed about this a lot, I just don't know if I can cast a vote for 434. It's just, maybe it's not pro-life enough, I wish it went a little further, etc. And that's understandable, and that happens. In that case, I would invite that person to just don't vote on 434 at all, just skip it. And then retain school choice, and then go down to the bottom, and 439, vote against 439. But do not vote against 434. That's actually gonna hurt it. I almost want to go so far as saying that's like indirect support almost for the abortion proposal in some way. So that said, signage and other kinds of things like that, okay? So the Catholic Conference is going to be sending stuff to parishes. So parishes will be getting things like the prayer cards, these one-pagers as bulletin inserts. They'll be getting all sorts of things like that, signage for the back of the church, etc. In terms of other signage, what I would say is there's a website on the one-pagers you got tonight, voteagainst439.com. Go to that website so you can get... you can download this one-pager, and that's easy enough to text to a friend, text to a family member, etc. So you have that as an opportunity. So far at the conference, we haven't created hey, buy your yard signs here, or buy your buttons here, stickers there. We're really not kind of made for that kind of campaign type of outfit. But Sandy's waving her hands, and Nebraska Right to Life does. Yes, okay, so Sandy with Nebraska Right to Life, they have yard signs. Get them from there. And I'm assuming probably also you're going to see from Protect Women and Children that they'll probably have that kind of stuff. We just haven't been able to have that kind of infrastructure yet for what we're doing.
I understood that we had to make a mark on both of them, right?
No.
Or no?
You can leave blank. You can always.
You could.
Leave blank.
So you could leave 430. You should vote for 434. But if you're really having concerns like I just don't know if I can do it, you could leave it blank. So you aren't for, just like with any other candidates, right? You don't have to vote on something specific, but you should definitely vote against 439. At least fill in that bubble. If you don't do anything else, fill out against 439 and retain 435 for school choice. So,
Two things.
Carthage must be destroyed.
I just attended a voting training workshop the other day, and an initiative voting option might be a distinction, but a ballot could get provisionalized, could get kicked out if something is not entered in a particular voting item. So we might want to clarify that in guiding people on whether or not to fill in an answer on a ballot.
Yeah, I would. Thank you. You're good. Okay, we're good. I would just reiterate, Initiative 439, the bishops are vote against it. I mean, that's like a moral imperative. Initiative 434, we're urging Catholics, all people of goodwill, to vote for that. And again, retain school choice on referendum 435. But again, when it comes to all the provisional ballots and things like that, I'm really not quite an expert in how those get sorted out or not sorted out. I know there's plenty of ballots where, I mean, I have my elected officials where I'm like, I don't even know who these people are, so I'm going to skip it. But I mean, thank you for raising that concern. So just know that, and that's part of the plug of being educated on as many candidates as possible, as many issues as possible, so you can vote up and down the ballot.
Hi. So it's my understanding that our current legislation for abortion limits healthcare providers but doesn't criminalize women. I think, if I remember when I actually read it a while ago, will this 434 have any direct impact on that?
No, so 434 basically keeps the current laws that we have in place. So current law does not provide any criminal punishments whatsoever for women. That's never been something on the table in pro-life laws, legislation, etc. So yeah, it would not impact anything like that. Yep.
So I'm one of the people, I haven't been sending emails, but my original question was, what's the downside of voting against both of these? And I think you answered to some degree. Could you provide a little bit of a backdrop? I mean, as the bishop said, 434 is not fully consistent with Catholic teaching. And in the context of 439, I understand it maybe as a strategic alternative, but at the same time, as a Catholic, I look at 434 and I look at the current laws, and it feels like 434 doesn't make any forward progress. In other words, it enshrines in the Constitution the laws and protections that we've already put in place over 50 years without any Constitution. And so part of my concern as a parent, as a Catholic, as the bishop said, the law instructs. And we've all seen A Man for All Seasons. Silence implies consent. And in this case, it's not just a silence that it doesn't appear in the Constitution, but we're prohibiting abortion in the second and third trimesters and silent on the first. And so, with great respect for everybody in the movement, I'm sure there are a lot of strategic considerations that went into this, but just as a layperson looking at this, can you give me some context for, why do we just dig in with a toehold that enshrines the current protections? Or maybe flip that question around, maybe a better way to ask it is, if both of these provisions fail, do we lose anything, or does 434, what do we really gain by 434 relative to all of the legislation that's currently in place? I also think that's an important point I want to find out about if you leave an item blank. I didn't know about that. But so maybe the back story.
So I'm gonna touch on a little bit of the legal side, and then Bishop, I think John Paul II's Gospel of Life incremental legislation I think would be a good thing to cover too. Flagging that for the bishop so I don't forget to hand off the baton. So here's what I would say. So I've made some of the defense here for 434. Okay, and you'll recall, our state constitution says nothing about, there's no protection right now for human life in the state constitution, zero. Okay, it's completely silent. And the reason for that is because under Roe v. Wade, you really couldn't provide that level of fuller protection in the state constitution. It would have been ruled unconstitutional. So again, providing protection in the second and third trimester is forward progress insofar as the state constitution is concerned. And again, you raise a legitimate concern of, hey, well, what about the first trimester? Those babies obviously have value, and we know that as Catholics fundamentally. So I think what you're wrestling with is very important. I mean, it's a thing that I wrestled with the first time I looked at this for about several weeks. Okay, can we support this? Can we not? So I would go back to that as well. But here's the other thing too, is even if we beat the other side this time around, they'll be back in 2 years. They'll be back 2 years after that. But if 434 has the ability to succeed, that provides a level of constitutional protection that they're going to have to then overcome in subsequent attempts. Because right now the pro-abortion side is dealing with a blank slate in terms of the state constitution. They don't have to fight against some level of protection that already exists in the state constitution. It's blank. And so they're trying to write on that blank slate a fundamental right. But I think by putting the win here that is achievable with 434 is if you put that in the Constitution, that's now something they would have to overcome in a subsequent election, in a subsequent attempt to try to create a fundamental right to abortion. And as we all know, amending state constitutions is a pretty hard thing to do. And it's pretty hard to do when the issue's silent, but then it's even harder to do when you already have some level of counter protection against it. So I think I would, it's a defense mechanism, and we still retain the ability to be able to proceed with our legislature to create more life-affirming laws. And that's something that we've been doing, for many, many, many years and decades at the Catholic Conference. And so I guess that's where I would go from that perspective, and then I'll hand it off to the Bishop on John Paul II.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The three bishops grappled with this when we looked at this wording. We talked long and hard and prayed about it. First of all, as Tom said, one abortion is too many, right? Because every life is sacred and should be protected. But we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And John Paul II said in the Evangelium Vitae that it was permissible for Catholics to take an incremental approach if their goal was to eliminate all abortions. And we made that clear, that we will not stop until every baby is protected and every woman is protected by law. But to get to that goal, we can take incremental steps along the way. And one of the things that convinced me to be, I was the holdout of the two bishops, he knows that. I took your position and I had the Archbishop and the Bishop on the other side. But what convinced me was that 434 what it does is it prohibits abortion beyond the first trimester. It doesn't say anything about from conception to 12 weeks. It does not state that abortion is okay, that it's fine, we're okay with that. It doesn't say that. It just prohibits everything after 12 weeks. So in conscience, I could say then, I can vote for this. And work like you know what through the legislature to put in protections all the way down to conception through the legislature.
Could we just get a clarity about that down ballot, if you leave one item blank? Do we have certitude? I want to say that we have certitude that you can do that.
So here's what I will just say. I don't want to, I'm not an election law expert or anything like that. My job is to lobby on social issues and those kind of things. I'm not sure how a county election commissioner or others are going to handle when they get a ballot and they say, hey, they left the race for Congress empty, or they left this judicial retention area blank or not. I'm not sure how they handle that, to be honest with you. That's something, as we would encourage anybody, if you have concerns about those things, bearing the light of Christ includes doing things like, hey, calling the local county election commissioner and just saying, hey, I heard this the other day. I just want to get clarity on this. Could you help me understand, what happens, when voters do leave maybe this section or that section of a ballot empty. Probably my encouragement there would be is that you sort of, take the bull by the horns and make those phone calls to your kind of like county election commissioners and ask them how that goes. Because I just don't have the knowledge to answer that tonight. And so that's a great thing, that's a way of engaging with the government to say, hey, how does this work? Because I want to be an active citizen, an informed citizen. I want to understand how this ballot works so that I'm not frustrated maybe one way or the other with how things might go. So that's what I would encourage.
Okay, thank you. Is there someone over here?
Yeah, I'll deviate a little bit. On the day of election, will there be signs out there near the polling places saying vote for 439? Do you anticipate that kind of thing? Okay. And I'm German. 434, vote for. 439, vote 9.
Outstanding.
Dr. Brooks, I just want to thank you for your courage and your love for being here tonight. And Bishop and Monsignor. Tom, just quick, maybe two somewhat broad but hopefully brief questions. Are there any predictors, other states that have had these similar initiatives? And then other question is, we went from 20 down to 12. How does it go from the legislature to the electorate? Things that feel like people think have been settled already, right? Some people have asked me in my church, we just voted for that. Why are we back doing this again? So.
What was the first question again? I have such a horrible memory.
Yeah, other states.
Oh, yes, yes, predictors, other states. So here's what I will say on that, which is, okay, when Michigan had a very similar proposal, okay, Michigan voted for a pro-abortion proposal like this one, 57% in favor to 43 against. And I thought, okay, well, that's Michigan, all right? So then they go to Ohio, and I thought, well, Ohio's gonna be different, right? I mean, Ohio's not Michigan. Politically, it's very different. Culturally, it's different. We're gonna get a different outcome in Ohio. Well, the results came out in Ohio, 57% to 43%. And I thought, well, that's not good. And one thing, and this is actually a comment Bishop Conley made at the beginning, at the outset of all of this one being launched in Nebraska, the response was, boy, I hope we're different than Michigan, right? So I hope we are. I thought Michigan was going to be different than, Ohio was going to be different from Michigan. I hope we're different from Ohio, and I hope we're different from Michigan. But again, going back to something Bishop Conley said earlier, that's going to take the hard work of everybody in this room and everybody outside this room. Okay, if we want to drop them from 57% down to 49%, it's going to take conversations, and it's going to take courage and boldness to have those conversations. You don't have to sit down and have a 3-hour lunch with somebody to convince them why they should be fully pro-life. You just need to convince them that 439 is just a little too far for even them, right? We're trying to kick an extra point here to keep the game going. We're not trying to win everybody over to the pro-life cause overnight by November 5th. If you can do that while you're doing it, go for it. But really right now, we have an incremental goal here of making sure 439 does not win. So we're getting people to vote against that. Or simply, if they were going to vote for it, at least get them to not vote on it at the very least. So that's where I would say you've got predictors in other states, but we've got to do the hard work to drop that number down. And so then I really think that's going to be key. So I forgot your second question because I have a horrible memory.
We went from 20 down to 12, right? And
Yeah.
So now why are we back here again?
Yeah, so we went from 20, so we had a 20-week pain-capable law, and then we tried to do, at one point, we tried to protect life from the moment of conception through what was called a trigger law. If Roe was going to be overturned, we would have immediate protection for the unborn at the moment of conception. We lost on that by a couple votes. We tried to do a heartbeat law, lost in a last moment. A senator jetted on us last moment, and so we were one vote short of passing a heartbeat law to protect babies with detectable heartbeats. So again, why are we here again? I would say I thought we were going to be okay just working in the legislature, but this goes back to what the pro-abortion special interest groups are doing. They can't win in the legislature, so what do? Well, let's go to the ballot. Let's pump in a bunch of money and get around the 49 people in the legislature and against a representative democracy. And let's just take it to the people, pour in a bunch of money, misinform the voters, and hope that we can get them to vote for this. And so that's why we're dealing with it now at the level of a ballot. And so when we get to the ballot, these initiatives, each and every one of you are a legislator. Think of that. Go home tonight and say, call me senator. Because when we get to the ballot, you're going to be a legislator. You're going to be making a fundamental law of Nebraska in the Constitution. That's a big responsibility. So talk to other people about that responsibility.
I really was reluctant to get up and say anything, but based on my past. Unless we're science deniers, we understand that our common understanding of abortion is that it is the deliberate killing of another human being. Initiative 439 will enshrine in the Nebraska State Constitution a right to kill. I am trying to increase my understanding about what are the significant implications, both moral and legal, of putting a right to kill in the state constitution. Tom, maybe you'd have a comment about that.
On 439?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just grappling with the moral and legal consequences of that?
Implications long-term of putting a right to kill in the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, I think, here's what I've been telling people. If you thought Roe versus Wade was bad, this is actually worse than Roe versus Wade.
Yes.
Okay? Because like I said, Roe versus Wade, at least we were able to chip away through the courts. Or at least it was always understood that the right was never completely unregulated. You could at least do some things at the level of the state legislature. This language is without interference from the state. It's a fundamental right, as my learned predecessor at the Catholic Conference said, it's a fundamental right to take the life of an unborn child deliberately, okay? And without any interference from the state, without any regulation from the legislature. That's worse than Roe versus Wade. So something worse than Roe is with us, okay? And that's a problem. And so when you think about all the moral, the legal, the cultural implications of what we lived through for the last 50 years, that's amped up sort of on steroids, and specifically here for Nebraska. It was one thing to have this federal problem that existed, at the national level. It's another thing to say this is in our own backyard, affecting our family, our friends, our neighbors, our fellow parishioners. It becomes very local, very quick, and again, like I said, I think it's worse. It's worse than Roe versus Wade.
Along that line, kind of on the implications, are there implications that we're going down our road as far as even doctors with a conscience, with having to be forced to perform these, or is there, I'm not sure with the language, is that a concern at all?
I think it's referencing, would there be a concern that doctors be pressured into acting in support of 439 to carry through these abortions?
I think medicine is already more pro-choice or anti-life than the general public. I don't know that I can't speak to the legal ramifications, but I think when the law changes, the culture changes, and so we're already faced with, why do you, some people ask, why do you take care of these babies that cost a lot of money and they, don't do well? Well, it's because they're valuable and they have dignity. So I don't know for sure what the legal ramifications are, but certainly the culture changes.
Tom, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure.
Conscience clause.
Yeah, so again, in Nebraska, like at the federal level, we have conscience laws that protect people in healthcare practice from having to participate either directly or indirectly in abortions, even like at the level of referrals, et cetera. And so, again, the question, I think, with those kind of conscience laws are going to be something like, is that an interference with the fundamental right to abortion? And I think the other side is going to say, yes, if you won't do what I asked you to do, then you're interfering with my right, and that's a problem. And that conscience protection that you have is interfering with my fundamental right, which is in the Constitution. It's not just a state statute, but it's a fundamental right in the Constitution. And so therefore, your conscience protection is getting in the way of my right to an abortion. And I'm arguing that ought to be unconstitutional because it's hindering, my ability to get the abortion. I think that's the argument that's going to be made at the level of conscience rights, and that's really concerning. And why this isn't so far-fetched is because you see conscience rights as a major issue all the time, right? Especially right now at the national level. And we've been working on conscience rights legislation for a lot of years, but in particular for the last few years, we've been really working hard to try to get conscience protections, and it's just really hard. Because people think that you're just trying to escape your obligations or duties, or honestly there's this concept that our healthcare practitioners are nothing more than a vending machine. It's somebody that I go up and I swipe my insurance card and I press A1 and the bag of chips falls down, and whatever button I press, the vending machine has to give me that service. And there's a real vision of the physician as vending machine rather than the physician as an autonomous human being with a conscience who is made in the image and likeness of God, who has the ability to exercise moral willpower and not just simply do what you are forcing them or telling them to do. And in addition to all that, we've seen legislation in recent years, particularly on the issue of basically abortifacient emergency contraception. We've seen legislation from some senators basically saying if you won't provide emergency contraception after sexual assault that we know will provide abortions, basically your hospitals will get fined thousands and thousands of dollars and you have the potential to lose licensure. Again, this is a direct attack on Catholic hospitals and what they have to follow with the ERDs and by our very faith. Again, these are attacks to make it seem like we don't care about women who are in difficult situations. But to basically say, if you don't want to do what we do, then we're going to fine you a bunch of money, and you're potentially going to lose license. So those are all conscience protections that get raised.
I would just add, not to speak for Dr. Brooks, but I would say if this passed, Dr. Brooks's practice would be pressurized. That you could be forced to do an abortion, right? If it's a fundamental right.
So I think that's going to be the question, is if it's a fundamental right, well then who has the duty to provide it to me? Does everybody have a duty? And if you don't want to participate in it, maybe you ought not work in the profession. But this was an argument, this came out like during post-Obamacare conversations, which was like, hey, if you don't want to, this was Rob Emanuel, who's one of the architects of Obamacare, and he said in a well-to-do New England Journal of Medicine, if you don't want to do abortions or pass out contraception, then maybe you should get out of medicine. Or maybe you should just go be a radiologist. That's the way he put it, right? So again, if you don't want to do these things, you don't even belong in medicine, right? That's the level of coercion I think that's taking place in conscience. And I know, speaking with med students and residents and others, that they think that they go, hey, I want to go into OBGYN practice. But then they're like, well, why do I want to deal with all the hostility that's going to come with that through my rounds and my clinicals and residency and maybe fellowships? Okay, so there's a real pressure on people to not exercise their conscience in this area. And I think when you're creating a fundamental right to something, it's going to call into question conscience protections that currently exist.
I'm not sure this is appropriate, but this discussion tonight is really very useful. And it's useful from the standpoint that it reminds all of us that we need to be vigilant and be educated to understand the implications of what's going on here. I'll be honest with you, I did not think of a lot of the things that were brought up tonight. One of the things I think we need to go away with was this initiative, the 439, is brought to you by the same people who put together the United Nations Agenda 2030. One of the platforms in that agenda is to reduce world population by 80%. Think about 4 out of 5 people, any 4 out of 5, which 4 out of 5 we're gonna get rid of. That's their goal. And they're the ones that are spending the money to put these kinds of things on and supporting it and trying to fake us out so that we're not informed and we do something we shouldn't do. So I've learned a lot tonight, and I'll try to share this with people I meet with from now till voting.
Thank you, Paul. And I think there was maybe one last question, okay.
Okay, actually mine is a comment. So I'm going to assume that most insurance companies are immoral and they dictate to us how our insurance monies are going to be spent. And they decide for us what procedures we can and cannot be entitled to. So with respect to a life-saving procedure for a baby, they can come back now under 439 and tell us that they're not going to spend the money on it. So you will have to face that cost of all those life-saving procedures on your own budget. And then also with respect to signage in front of ballot voting places, the requirement by state law is 120 feet from the, so you can't put signage out there, just so you know.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. We'll ask for His Excellency's blessing. I'd just like to reiterate a little bit. You know, we live church-going people. We live in our very nestled, sometimes very comfortable surroundings, you know, with similar thinking people. This call to have converse with 5 or 10, maybe family members who are not so church-going or not so like-minded, it can have a profound difference, and I'd just like to call you to that. And you know, yes, it's difficult, but you know, St. Joan of Arc's presently in vogue, right? We were made for these times. We're uniquely prepared for them. We're all people, you know, church militant, living in this kind of familiar setting where all is not right. Valley of Tears, as we say in the Hail Holy Queen. So just to remind yourselves of that, prayer and fasting are the order of the day. You know, what initially seemed like cause for celebration and is, in the overturn of Roe, you know, now gives way to a very real circumstance that we were ill-prepared for the unthinkable part, you know, making abortion seem unthinkable to our larger population. I'd just like to make a call out to recognize the trauma that abortion causes. It's, you know, as we're encountering these questions in a kind of more sterile or a legalese kind of mindset, we must never lose track of exactly what the bishop and I think the doctor and Tom all raised, but these questions about the trauma and the difficulty of the situation there. Abortion, like all of our sins, none of them are unforgivable. These are areas, though, that we wish to work through and to urge people to seeing that there's a better way through. We call it, John Paul II coined it, but the culture of life. This is the way to live life and to find nourishment and goodness. As it began, so we can conclude this way, you know, presented before us as Nebraskans is life or death. Choose life. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Monsignor, and thank you for moderating this. Good job. I think he's found another way to work. That's great. Also, John Paul II, you know, said a culture of life leads to a civilization of love, and that's what we always have to keep in mind. So, the Lord be with you.
With your spirit.
And may the blessing of Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit descend upon you and remain with you forever. Amen. Thank you, everybody.